Dan Liebenson, and I'm here as always with B'nai Lappi and our special guest today, Ilana Kurshan, who is the author of the award-winning book, If All the Seas Were Ink, a memoir, which is your memoir about your, well, it's about so much I probably can't do it justice, but it's the way that I think about it, it's a memoir and a travelogue through the 7.5-year Daf Yomi cycle. We've talked about it in passing on the show here and there. The idea is that this is a practice of actually more recent vintage than people, I think, know, and we should talk a little bit about that. But I think it was in the 1920s that people, particularly in the ultra-Orthodox community, started with this idea that if everybody reads one page of Talmud, and that means a double-sided folio page. So in the other worlds, it would be 2 pages. But we read a page a day of Talmud, and if you do that, then you can complete the whole Talmud in 7.5 years. So a lot of people have been talking about that lately because the most recent cycle of Daf Yomi started, I think, about 8 months ago, 7-8 months ago. And a lot of people, for some reason, I think we'll get into this a little bit, Ilana, started to do that. All kinds of people, and maybe I think inspired by Vinay and Svara, and started doing this. And it's not ultra-Orthodox people anymore. I mean, it's of course them too, but all sorts of people have been doing it. Some of them have still stuck with it, like me. And it's definitely a topic that's on a lot of people's minds. And so we're really excited to have you today to talk about this phenomenon of Daf Yomi as part of our larger exploration of the Talmud, the content of the Talmud, teaching of the Talmud, and so many other topics. So that was a long welcome. Ilana, welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I thought that maybe if we could start a little bit just to, in your own words, just to give us a little bit of a sense, like it's when you describe your book to people, when you describe, or even before it was a book, when you described the project, how were you talking about it? That you started this Daf Yomi, and how did that, I guess my question is, it ultimately the book that you produced is an interweaving of your life and the literature that you love and various experiences that you had along the way, and this 7.5-year cycle that you entered into. And I suppose my question is, did you plan all that in advance, or was it just that you happened to be doing these different things and at some point it hit you that they were interwoven and this is a book, or how did that project really come about?
Certainly nothing was planned in advance. I've always been a very active reader and a very passionate and devoted reader, which means in practice that I fill my margins when I read all sorts of books. And often I'll choose books based on how wide the margins are because I want to know how much space I'm going to have to write what I want to write in the margins. And that was certainly true of my study of Talmud. When I began learning, I was constantly taking notes on what I was learning. Some of it was just to remember what was the topic, because when you glance at a page of Gemara, at a page of Talmud at first glance, right, you have no idea what the topic is. Although maybe, the name of the tractate will be written on top, the name of the chapter is written on top, but the Talmud is so discursive, so full of digressions that very often the topic of the chapter or the tractate has very little to do with what you were actually learning on that page. So I was summarizing the topics under discussion. I was underlining phrases that spoke to me, vocabulary lists in the margins. And oftentimes, because I was learning a page of Talmud a day, I would be thinking about sort of connections between whatever it is that I was learning and whatever it is that was happening to me. Even just now, Daniel, when you were talking, you said, well, one page of Talmud, I guess it's one, but for us it's two. And immediately I thought in my head, Shnaim Shehim Arba, like the Talmud always has this take the phrase that one number is really a number, another number. So the laws of carrying on Shabbat are 2 that are 4 or whatever. So one that is 2. I'm always hearing those echoes. I'm always hearing echoes of what I'm learning. What I'm learning is always resonated with something else I'm learning or something happening in my life. So I would start writing in the margins connections between whatever it was that was happening for me as I was learning that page. And it's, I guess, I was learning for many years. And at some point, as I was approaching the end of my first cycle of Daf Yomi, that first 7.5-year cycle, a friend of mine said to me, "Oh, how are you going to celebrate your completion of the Talmud?" And I hadn't really thought about it, but then my friend said to me, "You've been writing so much, you should put all your writing together." And very quickly it became clear to me that, oh, I have a lot of writing, and pretty much it's organized by tractate, because that's how I learned. You learn one tractate after another. The Babylonian Talmud has 37 tractates. You learn them over the course of 7.5 years. They vary widely in length, but each one was sort of a unit with integrity. And so I began to put together my writings about each tractate, and really just for myself. I think at the time, if you had told me that maybe it would be published someday, I would have crawled under the table and never come out. I really wasn't thinking about sharing any of this. It was more just taking stock for myself of this journey. So that's how it all began.
So can you talk a little bit about Daf Yomi as you experienced it, as you thought about it beforehand? I think there's this question. I mean, I guess we should put some of our cards on the table, and this will be part of our discussion. Vinaya, you can feel free to, if you want, if you think it will be helpful to put your cards on the table in your own voice. The way that I interpret you is that you're skeptical about it because you think that you're not, that it's not really what the Talmud is about, is to really learn it at that pace. That the pace is, well, you should say what you think. Like,
yeah.
I think what I'll say actually is why I'm doing it. And so for me, it's two reasons. One is that my wife actually, who has much less of a lengthy Jewish education than I do, for some reason she heard about the Daf Yomi and it intrigued her, and she kind of wants to know kind of what's in the Talmud from a kind of an outsider's point. Like, she had no clue basically what was in the Talmud. For me, I had like some clue. We've studied a lot of Talmud in different ways, and deeply, especially with you, B'nai. And I think I have this sense that, like, okay, now that I've had that experience of studying deeply, I want to see everything that's in there, just so that I kind of will know, and I don't imagine that like it's that deep of an experience. I just kind of want to know, just so that if anybody asks me something, well, did you know that this is in the Talmud? I'd say, well, actually I did, So that's kind of what I'm after, I think, in a certain way. But talk a little bit about your perspective on it, I think.
Okay.
Let's get Ilana.
First I want to say, Ilana, that I thought your book was beautiful. I really enjoyed your writing and the way you interwove stories in the Talmud with what you're experiencing. I just thought that was beautiful. So I want to start with that. And then I want to come clean about the fact that I am for sure a Daf Yomi curmudgeon. And I have lots of sort of objections to what I think happens for most people through Daf Yomi. Oh, I think you might have lost your video.
Sorry about that. I became the stump.
I don't want to I am a big fan of the Talmud. I'm in love with the Talmud, and I never want people to misunderstand it or come to dislike it or think that it's that which is icky, and therefore see themselves as no longer being interested in it. That feels like a bad sales practice. And at the end of the day, I fear that Daf Yomi is just a bad technique. It's a bad strategy for most people. I think there's some small number of people who have already had a different experience coming to know the Talmud and understanding what it really is, and learning in a style called Be'iyun, or like slowly and in depth, and then are able to supplement that with the approach of Daf Yomi, which is, Bikiyu, to kind of broad, thin exposure to the content. I have so many particular objections. Before our conversation today, I actually wrote them all out on several pieces of paper, so I'm not quite sure where to begin. But I think I don't know if I should take up a lot of time just putting them all out on
No,
the table.
let's actually start with, I just wanted to kind of, my goal is to put our cards on the table, but then let Ilana start, because I love to hear
I just want to say
Okay.
that I just want to say I'm also in love with the Talmud. I think that's part of the reason why I can't stop doing Daf Yomi, even though I've tried. A friend once said to me that Daf Yomi is sort of like the bad boyfriend that you really know you should break up with, but you've just been together so long that you can't end the relationship. And I really identify with that. But I mentioned before that, that my engagement with the Talmud really began as sort of this an experience of really writing heavily in the margins, which led to the writing of my book. And I was just reminded as you were talking, when you said you're in love with the Talmud, one of my favorite poems is Marginalia by Billy Collins. And it's about everything that people have scribbled in the margins over the years since really the advent of print. But the poem ends with a line about someone's reading a used copy of The Catcher in the Rye, and the last line of the poem is, "Pardon the egg salad stains, but I'm in love." And I really identify with that, because when I'm learning, I find it very hard to stop learning, both in the moment, when I literally can't take my eyes off the page, even if someone is really competing for my attention or my baby is about to fall off the bed. This has happened. But also on a day-to-day, it's sort of like an addiction, a compulsion, and I can't stop. And if I'm eating egg salad, then there's egg salad in the Talmud. And I say that sort of metaphorically too, that whatever it is I'm doing at the time in my life, in the moment, gets reflected in that learning. So I would say that, I'd be interested to hear your, 95 theses or whatever, all your objections. But for me too, it is really a passionate relationship of love. So I think we're on the same page, at least there.
Can I ask you, Ilana, like so because I think this might be a way into also getting to some of B'nai's objections, because like B'nai, what you just said actually kind of spoke to me about that concern that people might fall out of love of the Talmud, right? Because my experience so far, and I think we're about 8 months in. I don't quite remember. I know it was before COVID because I was still traveling.
January 4th, I think.
Right, because I was still traveling in the days that we were starting, and that meant that we had to like do extra pages so that the days that I was away would be okay, or vice versa. So I remember it was like pre-COVID, and then post-COVID, we're doing it every night, my wife and I, and what's interesting for me, you talked about the bad boyfriend. For me, it's like I'm starting to ponder this question of whether it's the what I learned in economics class, the Concord fallacy, which is the idea of like throwing good money after bad. Because here we are in like the tractate of Eruvin. We just finished Shabbat, and before that it was brachot, blessings. And those were like, okay, Shabbat was kind of getting a little like monotonous, and now we're in this Eruvin, and it's like, oh my God, it's like it's so boring every page. And I know there's really good stuff in Eruvin, so I keep telling my wife, like, hold on, I know there's like really good stuff coming on page 13, and we're only we're on page 9, so it's coming soon. But there's this part where it's like my wife.
The bad stuff too is divrei Elokim Chaim. The bad stuff too is.
So that's what I really want to talk to you about a little. It's like, because I've been saying to my wife, she's been saying to me, like, I think this Eruvin might be the end of us, like not the end of us. I mean, the end of our experience with Daf Yomi, because she's like, I'm not sure how many more pages I can take of like discussing, exactly where the crossbeam that goes over an alley, what it has to be. And it's like just too much, and I think that I think I would probably, I might stick with it if I were by myself, because I could like just kind of read quickly over that part, because I kind of know it's not really. I think that I take B'nai to say, like, you can't. Yes, you could, if you really were going to spend weeks on some of those passages, you could find real meaning there. But it's really hard at the 1 day a page pace to take something that seems so boring and so monotonous and so kind of regulatory and find real meaning in it. So really, the only thing you can do is kind of skip over it. I guess my question is. Whether when you were doing Daf Yomi and you were in a page, like the first few pages of Eruvin, with all this technical detail, for example, was it like that you just kind of read quickly over those, or were you able to kind of linger in the same way?
I always love the first few pages of a Masechet, because I feel like I'm entering a whole new world with its terminology. Like, it has a very different landscape every time you enter a new Masechet, and you have to get to learn all the vocabulary, the conceptual vocabulary. What is a lechi? What is a korah? What are the different beams you have to put up to permit yourself to carry in an alley? I find this all, I love sort of entering that new world and sort of seeing, like, sometimes I oftentimes I'll learn, I'll listen to podcasts of Daf Yomi while I'm running, and I try to change my running route between tractates, because I remember what I'm learning based on where I am. So I love having sort of different background associations with what I'm learning. So I love entering a new Masechet. But I will say, yes, there are definitely pages that I find, not only pages, but whole, like sometimes even chapters, right, or sugyot, whole long passages that extend over many pages that I find less interesting than others, for sure. But what I love about Daf Yomi is that you see everything in context. And when you come to those greatest hit sugyot that you've studied hundreds of times before, or you've encountered, they're like on every shore sheet and every shiur, right, ever taught, right? When you see them in context, they take on a whole new meaning, right? And all of a sudden you say to yourself, oh wow, like, I never understood what that source means in the context in which it appears. I don't know. I remember, like, many times I studied the story about the man who goes to the prostitute and his tzitzit hit himself in the face, right? You always encounter that story in, like, greatest hits of the Talmud book. But I remember that when I actually learned that sugya, and I believe it's in Menachot, like, there's a whole section before about when you're allowed to sell your tzitzit, and there's this idea that you're not allowed to sell your tzitzit to a non-Jew mishum zona, because of a prostitute, and it doesn't explain why. And I remember that actually appears the page before and the day before in Daf Yomi, that story of the tzitzit and the harlot, and just suddenly I thought to myself, oh wow, so that's sort of setting the stage for what's about to happen. I never realized that story happens there. That's not a very good example, but just, I guess what I'm trying to say is that seeing things in context, for me, it's that sort of the surprise. So often I'm just learning through Masechet Shabbat page by page, and all of a sudden I don't even notice that I'm on Daf Peichet, and all of a sudden, like, Har Sinai is standing over my head like a bucket, and I'm like, here it is, Har Sinai like a bucket, but you just stumble on it, and then you realize, oh, of course I'm on Shabbat 88. Of course that's why, right? So some of it is that the pleasure of seeing everything in its context. And also I'll say, like, for me, because it's such a long-term commitment, you have a rough day, I guess it just doesn't get me down. You have a rough week, it doesn't get me down. I sort of view Daf Yomi, it's kind of like a marriage. You're in a marriage, for the long term, through thick and thin. You have good days, you have bad days, you have good periods, you have bad periods, you have rough patches. You make it up. You don't always make it up the next day, but you make up, maybe a few days later. And that's the same with me. And I guess the passages where I find that the text speaks to me less, make me appreciate the passages that do speak to me all the more so. And I'll say, I guess what helps me get through the rough passages, on this, now I'm in my I guess I'm at the end of my second cycle now. Yeah, that's right, I'm at the end of my second cycle, and what has really helped me now is, on this cycle, I've been learning through the Mishnayot. Before I learn every parak, I try to go through all the Mishnayot first. The Mishnah is the oldest layer of the Talmud. The Talmud is sort of a commentary on the Mishnah that includes the Mishnah. And I have a pocket size, Kahati Mishnayot that I carry with me everywhere I go. I used to carry my Talmud volumes everywhere I go, but they're kind of heavy, so that doesn't work with my current lifestyle. But anyway, but yeah, so I carry the Mishnah everywhere I go. Whenever I have a free moment, I'll learn. I remember one time I was waiting in line at the airport for, like, the security check, and they asked me for my passport, and I gave the Mishnah instead because it looks basically exactly the same. So it's always in my hand, and that really helps me just to stay rooted, not to lose sight of, like, the key concepts, so that when that more technical aspects I start to feel like I'm drowning, I always have the Mishnah as kind of like my I don't know, my life raft, or like my buoy, like the thing that I can hang on to when I feel like I'm sinking. I reach up and I can, connect back to whatever Mishnah we're on. So that really helps me. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I really appreciate what you're saying about context. And I think that's a great point. And it is something that I feel is missing in the way that I learn, because I do tend to isolate my learning. When you're doing bi'iyun, super, in-depth learning, you tend not to appreciate the context. And Dan, yours in my learning of the sugya in Shabbat 54b about one who has the possibility of challenging injustice. I had never learned, for example, the story about Rabbi Elazar's cow and how that shifted for me the understanding of that passage. So not that I want to keep points and not like this is a competition, but I want to give you that point, Ilana, because I agree with you completely that that's really important and can really change how you understand what this particular passage that you're interested is really doing.
Yeah.
And what I'm also hearing you say is you're using Daf Yomi as a spiritual practice of just doing something without stopping and having
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
I so much identify with that. It's the kind of thing where like I relate to Daf Yomi, I think the way most people relate to their davening. Like really, it's just something I have to get through before my day can start. Like it's like, you know, you have the day has not, or brushing your teeth, davening, brushing your teeth, choose whatever, you know, whatever works for you, right? It's like, I can't start my day until I've learned a daf of Talmud. It's a ritual. It's something, and there are days when I get nothing out of it, but it doesn't matter. I just have to do it, right? It's like, you know, like the time just has to pass, you know, and I have to get it done and have it under my belt, and then I can begin my day. And the accumulation of all those sort of checks off the list, I think leaves me with something very meaningful and very satisfying. But what I'm left with is not necessarily the content of the Talmud. I think it's more a sort of way in which that spiritual practice has shaped me as a discipline, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get that. And okay, so here come some more of my difficulties.
Yeah.
One is that, as you say, it isn't so much for the content, it's the ritual of doing it every day. And I think it's just so likely for people to misunderstand that the content of the Talmud that they're able to get out of that day is what the Talmud is about. And I regret that misunderstanding that happens.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, but don't you think that the likelihood of that happening is so much lower if you're going at a rapid pace because you're just seeing so much more? Like I actually, so I we were discussing, I teach at the conservative yeshiva, and I had this very strong objection to the way the teaching was done. It's an institution where students come for a year to study, usually sort of 1 year out of their lives, and then go back to whatever it is they were doing. And often, you know, in the past, students would come and they'd learn and as you said, in depth, like, you know, one chapter of Gemara. And at the end of their year in Israel studying Talmud, people would ask them like, oh, so you're learning Talmud. What is the Talmud about? And they would say, oh, it's about, can you carry a dead body on Shabbat? That's what the Talmud's about. And I was like, how can you say that? So anyway, like, you know, as in like, that's what you've seen over the last 10 months, but so I started teaching, now I started teaching a class last year. I called it an aerial tour of the Bavli. And the idea of the class was that every week we learned one sugya from a masechet, and we went through every masechet in order. And so by the end of the year, they had seen one sugya from every single masechet, like, you know, now, and I was the one, of course, who chose the sugyot. So this was a lot of fun for me because I got to teach, you know, my favorite passages. But at the same time, what it enabled me to do was to say to them, like, let me give you sort of, you know, a bird's eye view, you know, of what are the types of issues that come up? What is the nature of this discourse? Because you're not just looking at a laundry list of like, these are the topics that come up, or these are the names of tractates. You're learning those sugyot in, you know, some degree of depth, but you're gaining such a breadth of knowledge as if you're really flying on an airplane over, you know, over
okay.
the Talmud.
Okay, well, let me push back on you. I think both of those approaches share the exact same problem. They just differ in amount, not in kind. In other words, both the student who said, I think what the Talmud is about whatever you said, you know,
carrying a dead body on Shabbat or whatever.
Whatever. I think that's missing what the Talmud is really about, because that person was taught in depth without a take that gets at what's really going on here. And they think what's going on are the details of the case. Your approach is the same thing. It's just lots of details of lots of cases, but both fundamentally miss what the Talmud is really about. The Talmud is no more about, in my opinion, a breadth of cases, lots and lots of details, any more than the analogy that I've often made. A case book in law school is about the specifics of the cases in that textbook. So for me, the Talmud is trying to do two things. It is trying to convey the DNA of how our tradition has and could and should in the future, sometimes radically reconfigure material that we've inherited that we now recognize is inadequate. And the process of learning is a technology for shaping people into a certain kind of human being. A human being who holds
I 100% agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, except I'll bet we disagree at what exactly is the changing kind of stuff. For me, you don't change because you've learned a bunch of stuff. That's a literacy model, which I think is fine if the stuff you're learning actually works in your life and in the world. But I don't think we're in that place in the world, and that's why I don't think knowing stuff really is transformative.
I'm not sure. Well, I don't know. I'll say to you, I think a lot of what one is meant to get out of the study of Talmud is not the content of the Talmud. It's an approach to strangeness. It's what do we do when we encounter something that we think we fundamentally disagree with? How do we argue? How do we listen? How do we listen before we speak? How do we understand the other? Like I see a lot of what the way in which the engagement of Talmud transforms the learner. Yes, some of it is that you become acquainted with material that you've never encountered before, for sure. But I definitely think it's so much more about the how. The machloket is the engine of the Talmud, right? How does disagreement fuel the evolution of our tradition? What does it mean to have a tradition that thrives on sort of that friction, that tension? And how can we learn from the way the rabbis of the Talmud relate to what came before them and relate to each other? I think that's a lot of what I get out of my learning, which is very different from saying it's all about content.
So I feel like I have a very Talmudic comment at this moment, because I'm actually loving this conversation for two reasons that are very much connected to the tractate that we're currently studying, Eruvin, right? Which is, number one, this is a little bit out of order, but in a Talmudic way. Eruvin, page 13b, is what B'nai and I were just talking about on last week's show. This whole story about Hillel and Shammai disagreeing, the houses of Hillel and Shammai.
Oh, so that's also a classic example, right? Why do we decide the halacha like Hillel and not like Shammai? Because Hillel always put Shammai first, right? I feel like that is such an important model for us. What does it mean when you disagree with someone? When before you jump in and say, I mean, I've probably done this to you, B'nai, many times in our podcast, sort of violating
and vice versa.
Right? But what does it mean? Not to interrupt, right? Not to jump in or to say, wait a second, but to say, wait, I hear what you're saying, right? Near inly what you're saying. I hear you. You're saying X, Y, Z. And I see truth to X and I see truth to Y. I hear Z, but I disagree, right? To have that humility and to be able to repeat the opinion you disagree with, or to place your rival first, right? I think that is such an important lesson that could radically transform political discourse and all discourse today, right? That is such an important. I did not listen to that show, although I would like to. But so much of what I take out of the argumentation in the Talmud is really values-driven advice for how we are meant to I would say to relate to strangeness and to relate to the other, which are often one and the same thing. And it's sort of an It's sort of the antithesis of like Facebook culture, where you're always gravitating towards and surrounding yourself with opinions harmonious with your own, consonant with your own, right? What does it mean to say, I am going to place myself around the stuff I disagree with, and I'm going to let it rub up against me. I'm going to let it chafe against me. I'm going to let my skin, wear away a little bit because I'm chafing against so much strangeness. And then I'm going to say, wow, I'm a different person because now my skin is chafed away. Like, that's what happens to me when I learn. What does it mean? What does it mean? What would it mean to really think that if you leave water uncovered overnight, you can't drink it because it means a snake might have drunk, or whatever, like all the weird things we find in the Talmud, and also, wait, there's one other thing I really want to say, which is just that, the Talmud is not more than content. And when I have those boring dapim, part of what keeps me going, Dan, to get back to what you were saying, is I love the metaphors in the Talmud. And even just in these opening dapim of Eruvin, there was something we saw, I think yesterday, 2 days ago, about Michol HaKerem and Karachat HaKerem, that a vineyard has like a dance around it and a bald spot. And it's a metaphor for, it's about planting mixed seeds that aren't allowed to be planted together. But what if there's a certain space where there is no planting? Can you then plant in the middle? Well, if that empty space is in the middle, it's kind of like a bald spot in the vineyard. And if it's around the perimeter, it's sort of like it's like a dancing in a circle around it. I love the images. I love the metaphors. And very often what stands out for me on a page are I'll not follow anything. I'll be completely lost in the halachic back and forth, but I'll love a particular metaphor. And that's what we'll see. I was reading today with my kids. I'm reading out loud to my kids the Narnia series. And today in the car, we finished, we don't have a car, but we were borrowing a car, or whenever in the car, I read to them.
No judgment, no judgment.
No. Well, they beg for a movie and I start reading before they could. But yeah, anyway, we're not in the car all that much, but when it happens. So we're in the car and I was reading them the very end this afternoon of Prince Caspian. And at the very end of Prince Caspian, the 4 children, Lucy, Edmund, Susan, and Peter, reverse order, they go through this sort of portal back into the, when the book starts, they're waiting on a bench in England to go to school, and suddenly they're transported to Narnia. And at the end of the book, they have to go back to like the bench at the train station to go to school. And the way they do it is all of a sudden, these 2 posts spring up with a post on top. And I was reading this out loud in the car, and like my husband and I, also my dad and I, were both like, Surata Petach, which is like an image from Eruvin. But it was like, when you're learning something, especially when everyone in the world is, all that, there's a community of learners learning the same thing, it becomes your metaphor. And even though I can't tell you, could I tell you, like, when you need this kind of post and when you need that horizontal post, when you need a vertical post and when you need both, could I tell you all the details? Absolutely not. I cannot at the superficial level that I'm learning. But when I come to that scene in Narnia, you betcha I'm going to shout out Surat HaPetach. And for me, that's worth it. Like, that makes it worth it. The metaphors, the images that inform every aspect of what I'm doing in the rest of my life, that's part of what has me hooked.
Well, I have 2 comments here. One, I want to go back to what I was saying before about Eruvin, but before I do, it's so interesting to hear you just describe that, because, you're an author and I've known you since you were in college. Like, you were always a literary person. You were, reading poetry, Rilke. I remember you walking in the streets of Cambridge reading Rilke, and I was like, who's Rilke? And so it's fascinating to hear somebody who loves Rilke, somebody who reads at that level, and how you're taking out of Narnia. Like, this is how a person like that reads the Talmud, because I wish that, I wish that those metaphors came to me when I was reading, because, I being more of a law school trained kind of lawyer thinking person, right? I tend to get excited when I find, oh, this is just like, contract law, this is just like constitutional law. So what's fascinating is that everybody potentially can find, something in there that gets them excited, and it's so interesting to hear you describe that. The one thing that I wanted to say about where we are in Eruvin and this whole idea of, there's the idea of Hillel and Shammai, which is like, but what I want to talk more about is like, like the happenstance of Daf Yomi, right? Because it just so happens that the first episode of the Oral Talmud, where we have a little bit of friction with our guest, where we're not all on the same page, is the week after we've studied that that text. And I think that there's that, where two people disagree and yet they're both the words of God, right? And so I love the idea that these things just sort of happen to happen. And like when we studied that text that B'nai was just talking about before from the tractate Shabbat about the failure to protest and the sin sort of coming on you, that was just around the time just before I think all the George Floyd killing and all of the things that were happening in terms of protesting. And it was like, on the one hand, you're kind of like, whoa, is this like, no accident, but the other thing that's really interesting to me in your book is that you actually were doing Daf Yomi. I guess it wasn't off cycle, but you had started the cycle late. And so you kind of came around to it later. So I guess it's not really what I was going to say, but what it's making me think about is just the oddity that in the 8 months that I've been doing it, there have been many times when it just so happens that what was in today's Daf Yomi page is something that's kind of relevant to my experience of the world. Sometimes it's like world events, but sometimes it's just something that I've gone through. And I'm sure if the cycle was 6 months off, it would be the same, right? So it's not that there's something magical happening, but there's something about this relationship, right? And the only other thing that I wanted to just mention to B'nai is that about 2 or 3 days ago, there was a scene in Tractate Eruvin with Hillel and Shammai. Now I'm blanking on what it was exactly, but I took a lot of notes. My wife and I take notes when we have like a little notebook and we're like writing some notes while we're studying. And I like wrote down this whole bunch of notes and she's asking me like, what are you writing? Because it's basically a boring page. And I'm like, no, there's this stuff about Hillel and Shammai. And I know that that's coming in, 6 more pages, that there's this part about Hillel and Shammai that B'nai and I studied. And I thought it was just kind of random and out of the blue, but actually there's this interesting thread of like the Hillel and Shammai going through this particular tractate. And like Ilana is saying, this particular tractate, which as we've talked about, happens to be about legal fictions, and so it kind of makes sense that there would be this like interwoven thread in particularly that tractate that's about kind of the sort of, legal argumentation. Whereas in like Masechet Brachot, for example, the tractate about blessings, there was all this stuff about demons that hasn't come in again since then. So, but it's sort of relevant because when you're talking about blessings, like you're talking about like the kind of the more mystical elements that are floating around like the demons. So what I am saying, B'nai, is just that there is this element that I am getting out of it, that like when you kind of just cover the ground, there are things that you do see, that you wouldn't see otherwise. So that's where I'm kind of like struggling to hold.
And I think all that is great, but I don't think that's what the Talmud is here for. It's like, that's icing on the cake. There's no question that there are wonderful life lesson kind of aphorism stories. And I noticed, Ilana, that most of what you bring into your book comes from sort of the Agadata, the narrative material in the Talmud. And that stuff is beautiful. No question about it. And learning lots of it can create lots of hooks for, what your experience in life, and, allow for metaphors. But my worry is that that becomes in the mind of the learner what the Talmud is here for. And I don't think it is at all. And I am a fan of icing. That's my favorite part of the cake. but I actually don't want the cake to get missed. Okay, hard return. I want to challenge you on another piece, and that is another one of my.
On the daf, like just recently, about the Mizbech of Zahav having only the slight layer of Zahav on top, and there was something very significant about how a miracle happened because it was only a slight layer of gold. I don't remember. Anyway, never mind. But that's what comes to mind when you talk about the icing. I'm thinking it's a little layer of gold.
The best I can do from my Daf Yomi experience is that what you're saying sounds familiar. I completely blanked on it too.
Right.
Okay, here's another one of my pet peeves about Daf Yomi.
Yeah.
The way it usually looks. And my problem is for the people for whom it looks this way, not the very small number of people who are able to learn and see the cake layer. Mm-hmm. But for most people, they are perforce in a very passive position. the teacher in front of the room, the teacher on the other side of the headphones, or, you know, the call or the whatever who's doing the broadcast or the teaching is the person who really has a deep understanding of the text. And the person, quote unquote, doing Daf Yomi is just watching that person rattle off and speak out a lot of material, leaving the recipient, leaving the person, quote unquote, doing Daf Yomi with the impression, oh, they're really smart. I could never do that.
And also that the Talmud is leaving with them with the misimpression that the misapprehension that the Talmud is monological, when the Talmud is in fact very dialogical, entirely conversation with many loose threads that never get picked up, and many open questions and many rough edges, which get sort of smoothed over. So 100% agree with you.
Fair enough. So I'm interested in people learning the Talmud in such a way that they see themselves as future teachers of it. And I don't know if Daf Yomi as a way of learning has ever produced, through Daf Yomi, a person who then becomes a person who is able to teach Daf Yomi. In other words, I don't think it's an empowering methodology or pedagogy, which really does what I think we need to be doing right now, which is creating people who can see themselves as owners of the tradition rather than passive recipients and, you know, I'll never be that. What do you think of that?
Part of what I love about studying Talmud is that because it unfolds as a series of conversations, right, among rabbis, as if the tape recorder were left on in the Beit Midrash, and because those conversations happen as if miraculously across time, you know, as in Rava in the 4th century responds to something said by Hillel in the 1st century, as if they were contemporaneous, and then, you know, the Talmud will give like what Hillel would have said to Rava, right? Like, and you have that whole, you know, sort of collapse of time and also collapse of space, where rabbis in Babylonia and in the land of Israel are engaging in dialogue, even if separated, right, by great distance, by considerable distance. Part of what that discourse does is that when we are learning that text in the 21st century in Jerusalem, or, you know, wherever we are, Chicago, I don't know, anywhere in the world, wherever we are, right, when we're learning that text, it becomes almost like so easy, so natural to insert our voices into that conversation, right? If the Talmud can imagine Moshe sitting in the back row of Rabbi Akiva's Beit Midrash, then why can't the Talmud also imagine me, Ilana Kurshan, sitting in the back row of Rabbi Akiva's Beit Midrash, and all the strangeness, all the unfamiliarity, just as Moshe felt it, I feel it too, right? Like, and that's part of what I love about this discourse, that you can't just be a backseat driver. You can't, even if you are learning in the way you're saying, where the teacher is doing all the work and you're just listening, and maybe you're just listening while you're washing the dishes, but the nature of the discourse invites, there's so many gaps, so many rough edges, so many places that don't quite fit together. You know, you can put like rectangular bricks. If you're stacking them, there are no spaces in between. But when you're stacking like triangles, you're always going to have those empty triangles. Or I don't know. Sorry, I'm not giving a good example. But, you know, as in like stacking these sort of weirdly shaped, like irregular polygons. You know, let's say you stack them up and they don't all fit together, and there are all these holes. That's how the Talmud is. There are all these holes, and you, the reader, burrow into those holes. You find your nook, your cranny, your space, your, you know, nikrat hatzur, or whatever. Like, you find your little space that's yours, and it's the nature of the discourse that has you do that. I don't think it's possible to learn this text passively. Like I often, the way I learn right now, I've gone through many different ways of learning, from shiurim, podcasts, reading from Steinsaltz, whatever, over time, many different ways, depending on, you know, am I in a library every day? Am I stuck at home because I'm in the middle of a pandemic, whatever it is, you know? But the way I'm learning now, I learn with Steinsaltz. I read through the daf with Steinsaltz and Rashi, and then usually 2 weeks later, I'm sort of, or a week or two gap, I listen to a podcast as chazara, like it's a review what I'm learning. And I listen to the podcast usually while I'm out and about, either walking or jogging. And when I'm listening to the podcast, I'm always shouting things. Like I'm finishing sentences of the teacher because I've seen the daf before, more than once at this point. I'm raising objections. I'm crying out, but wait a second, that doesn't, it's a very active process. Now, I know it's not that way for everyone. And I agree with you that the Daf Yomi is not there to train teachers of Talmud. I don't think that Daf Yomi is the be all and end all of Talmud learning. I think it's a wonderful introduction. I think it's a wonderful first step. It's a wonderful way.
Oh God, please let it not be an introduction or first step. I think it's a terrible first step and introduction.
But that's what I think is so interesting about what you're saying. Like, I mean, like Ilana, you should finish, but I mean, I think like that's what I was gonna like come in and talk about, but I want to have Ilana finish, and I have a comment.
Sorry, Ilana, I interrupted you. Please go ahead. Okay.
No. I find it very, very helpful to see the lay of the land before you, it also helps you figure out, like, where am I going to, which well am I going to dig deeper? Where do I want to set down my roots? What's out there, and where, and I would say, Dan, in response to what you said before about sort of how somewhat, it's kind of uncanny how, in the 8 months you've been doing Daf Yomi, there've been so many overlaps, what's happening in the world, what's happening on the Daf. Look, I agree with you. It would happen no matter what we were learning. I think it's sort of like, when you look up at the night sky, everyone sees the same stars, but not everyone sees the same constellations. We all connect the dots in different ways, but it's a basic human tendency where, we're all storytellers. That's what it is to be human. Right? It comes very naturally to us to connect those dots, to impute causality, even if there is no causality, and to impute, to assume a narrative or construct a narrative. I used to listen to this when I first started learning Daf Yomi. I don't think there were any sort of a liberal podcast. Like, you wanted to listen to a shir about Daf Yomi, all I could find in English, were rabbis from Yeshiva University teaching. So that's what I listened to. And I remember the rabbi who taught used to always say, he would often find connections. He'd say, and wow, look at this, we're learning this on Erev Purim. And he would always have this line, coincidence? Hashgacha? You decide. He would say that all the time. Is this a coincidence or is it divine providence? And I love that. We don't know. Is it coincidence? Is it divine providence? But a lot of it is, it's what we see. It's the active role that we are taking as listeners in making meaning. We have to be the meaning makers when you learn Daf Yomi. To say, when you learn the Talmud according to a predetermined schedule that you have not decided, but that becomes sort of like the soundtrack for your life or the backdrop for your life. That it forces you to be active and to make meaning. And so whether or not it makes you into a teacher of Talmud, I agree with you, B'nai. I don't think it does, but I do think it demands a lot more active participation than you seem to think.
I mean, I'm not trying to like just be, of the disciples of Aaron and bring a peacemaker here, but I that's a line from the Talmud, from Pirkei Avot. But I a little Talmud inside humor here. But I am trying to do that, but I'm also not I actually find myself like really in the position of saying, these are both the words of the living God, or the living words of God. We were even debating over which is the right translation of that statement last week. But it feels like, I think, B'nai, like my question for you is like, in part, it's this question of like, how would you feel about a weekly daf as opposed to a daily daf? That's not an actual question, but I'm saying, like, is the concern that you have sort of primarily that the pace of a daily, really 2 pages is too fast to really get into depth, and it's really that your concern is that if one doesn't experience the Talmud with great depth, and clearly Ilana has got a Daf Yomi approach of that gets to great depth, right? Because she's studying and then listening to a podcast a week later, or whatever. There's a lot to it. So if everybody was doing that, now I'm not suggesting that that's the daily, that's too much for everyone. But if it was weekly, would it be okay? Because then at least you would get the depth. Or is the objection, and I know it's all of the above, but I mean, like, it's the driving objection that however slow your pace of study may be, if your aim is to cover ground as opposed to sort of explore the elements of the Talmud that a teacher, for example, has really identified as the ones that best convey this larger project of the Talmud, which you can then take those that what you've learned about how the process works. And then you could go read any part of the Talmud you wanted, but you would be reading it the right way because you would have already absorbed this process. Is it that you fear that will never happen if one takes a Daf Yomi approach? And then I guess my question is basically, if somebody already studied with Svara, by the way, we studied this not too long ago, that the story of Rabbi Meir, who goes to study with Rabbi Akiva, and he doesn't understand anything he's talking about. And he first goes to study with Rabbi Ishmael, and he learns, Gamar Gemara, he learned whatever that means, he learns his learning, and then he comes back to Rabbi Akiva and he Savar Svara, he's able to reach it at this higher level. Now we have a debate for the sake of heaven here, I think, about whether the Daf Yomi is the right way to start or Svara way is the way to start. But whichever one you say, I'm asking in a way both of you, is it the case, would you agree that it's the case that once you've absorbed that Gemara, then it's okay to go for your Svara at the other one, or is it?
Especially since the nature of the Talmud is that, sort of every page of Talmud assumes that you already know every other page of Talmud. So there's really no way to begin learning Talmud until you've first learn the entire Talmud, right? So it's all a warm up, right? As in the first time you learn everything, it's all just a warm up. It's all just a prose door leading to another realm, we could say. It's all just a corridor.
B'nai, where do you take my question?
Well, I really appreciate your question, Dan, because you've helped me identify that it's not just the speed, because, and this gets back to my critique of your critique, Ilana, of the student who spent a whole semester on one sugya and then thinks that's what the Talmud's about. While learning quickly doesn't afford one the ability, I think, to really understand the meta of the content and what I think the Stama, the redactor, is really trying to convey, which for me is always without fail a methodology for change. It's not only that speed doesn't do that. You can learn Talmud as slowly as you want, but without that lens, you're still going to be simply mining for this. You're going to be reading the surface content just slowly. And it isn't simply depth. It's like the icing and the cake are actually two completely different things. It's not like if you go slowly, you understand the depth of the flavors of the icing. No, there's something underneath that surface content, which is, for me, what the Talmud is really here to bring, that can't be accessed no matter how slowly you go if you're not actually reading for that. Certainly it's impossible to get at when you're learning in a sort of Daf Yomi passive way. One thing I want to ask, Ilana, you're disagreeing with me?
I mean, I'm just thinking back to my encounter with the opening dapim of Eruvin, and yes, it's true. I could have been totally caught up in all the details of, the different types of legal fictions that we're constructing and what they look like and their dimensions. But what stayed with me from the opening dapim of Eruvin was that I think the opening daf, first or second daf, right? The rabbis talk about how everything they know about how you construct these markers to show that you can carry within an alley. The way they do this, it's all based on the temple. It's all based on the door between the ulam and the heichal. And that really got me thinking. And when I said, it's so interesting how for the rabbis, the whole Talmud, I think, is like this post-traumatic stress response to the Churban, right? Like the temple was destroyed. Oh my gosh, and I think that the ruined temple lurks on the backdrop of every page of Talmud. And it's not incidental that Eruvin starts with, where did they learn this from? Where did they learn it from? From the Heichal. And there's a machloket. Did they learn it from the Ulam or from the Heichal? From which part of the temple? But not everyone thinks they learned it from the temple, that too. But there's this sense that, right, every structure in the Talmud is a ruined temple or is a rebuilt temple. And all I'm saying is that metaphorical level is, I don't think it's fair to assume that it's lost on the learner.
Yeah, but I I so disagree with how you're reading what the rabbis are doing in the Talmud about the temple that I think it's a perfect example of our dispute here. Because I think while they may be using the language of despair and loss and, oh, that we don't have a temple and, oh, one day, that's not what, if you are taking them sort of at their word and not reading for the meta message, you're precisely falling into the hole that I think is so tragic, which is that I don't think that tragedy at all is what the rabbis are talking about. I don't think they're upset that the temple is no longer there. I think, as Dan says, they're creating a kind of process of mourning for people to be able to let go of that which they're thrilled is no longer here. And that's a take that I think you miss when you accept the surface content as if that's what they're trying to do. I think you're missing the meta.
But B'nai, my question is that you and Ilana potentially do or maybe don't, but I mean, would that be the topic of another show? The question of like, what was the rabbi's real agenda? That's in itself an interesting question.
What was their relationship to the Churban?
Right,
yeah.
But to what extent is that a coterminous conversation to the question of whether breadth or depth is the best way to study Talmud? Because I mean, there's certainly people who study Talmud in depth who accept that more, I wouldn't call it surface level. I would say the more public presentation of the Talmud by the rabbis, and say that that's actually what they thought. And there's some people that study in depth like you that have a different take, but yeah, that's different from the daily versus the, isn't it?
Right. Well, that's why depth doesn't matter if you don't have a take, if you don't have a lens on what is really going on, which I believe is wholly other than the specifics of the content material, then no matter how slowly you learn it, you're still going to miss the point. And you're yeah.
But is it better to start with a teacher telling you, top down, like, this is what's happening, and now we're going to look at a sugya that demonstrates that, or to say, read the whole Talmud and try to figure out as you're going along what's happening. And that's going to shift, and it's going to shift based on what you're reading and where you are and where you're standing vis-a-vis the text. Like, I think they're just different approaches to extracting meaning.
Well, Ilana, let me ask you this, because we're also running out of time. But like, this is where my former law professor, lawyer hat comes in. And I remember, I think I mentioned this to B'nai before, but like I was talking to one of my friends that you probably know him also, but he was a law professor, and I said that we're starting this Daf Yomi thing, and he said, I don't know, why would you do that? Because like I'm a law professor and I don't like read the whole federal reports, all the cases. So I guess my question there is like, we do have this impulse, by the way, which I share with you. Like, I'm excited about I don't know if I'm going to make it, but I'm excited about the idea in only a short 6 years and 3 months, 6 years and 9 months more from now, I'm going to know everything that was in the Talmud, So like, I'm very excited about it. And at the same time, I'm also kind of conscious of this critique that might say, what, that's not really the way that lawyers study law. The way that lawyers study law is that there is a teacher, a law professor, right, who maybe has studied more broadly, or maybe has studied from their teacher. And there are dangers to this, right? Because what if your teacher gets it wrong? But that there is some way where the teacher says, well, here's, I've presented a set of selections for you that in some ways really gets at what I believe is the fundamental, and in a conservative law school, you're going to get a different take than in a very liberal law school, right? And so like, there's definitely like, how do we resolve all that? Or do you think that like, because the Talmud is shorter than the federal reports, like that there is this capability of doing it, and therefore it's a good thing to do and it's more achievable? How do you look at that?
Me?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't read the Talmud as a book of law. I don't relate to the Talmud as a book of law. I don't particularly enjoy studying halakha. I've studied very little halakha. For me, the Talmud is about how we argue. It's about conversations. It's about the relationship between law and narrative. It's about what law can do versus what narrative can do. And I am coming to it looking for very different things. I also think that, there are times in life that lend themselves to the kind of deep engagement with the text that Binay is describing. And there are times in life when I think that's simply not possible. I think if it weren't for Daf Yomi, it's funny, I actually was having a conversation yesterday with a friend who's a law professor. And I have two friends, they're married, they're both law professors, and we were visiting we're at a pool yesterday where kids are on vacation, and they were telling me about a paper they're writing, and the topic of the paper was are you allowed to download things off the internet and not pay for them if they're copyrighted or something? And anyway, the answer apparently, the law says that if you would pay for it, then you're not allowed to download it for free. And if you wouldn't download it unless it were, if you wouldn't download it unless it were free, then you're allowed to download it for free. And I was thinking about this, and I thought to myself, well, wow, if it weren't for Daf Yomi, there's no way I would be learning Talmud right now at this point in my life. Like, absolutely no way. At a time when, like, all my kids are home, there's no school, and we don't know if school's even going to start again for sure. And I get maybe 2 hours to myself once everyone's asleep, and at that point I'm exhausted. Like, would I ever be doing Daf Yomi? No. But because I have this kind of addiction that's been going on for 15 years, like, no way I'm going to get divorced now from the Talmud. Like, I'm kind of stuck with this, right? And I think, I guess what I'm saying is part of what we have to consider is, what is the alternative? Like, would you be doing this otherwise? And I think what Daf Yomi becomes for a lot of people is you sort of commit to something, and at a time when you otherwise would have no relationship with the Talmud, you have some relationship. Now, Binay, you may say that relationship is so detrimental that better to have no relationship. But I, to that, would say that I truly believe that the more people who study Talmud, the more faces of the Talmud we reveal. And if we leave the Talmud only to people who have the time to put in like 7 or 8 hours a day, or even 2 or 3 hours a day sitting in the yeshiva learning, then we're going to seriously limit the range of insights we're gaining into the Talmud, and we're not going to see all those 70 faces of Torah. So I think I guess what I'm saying, I think we really need to think about sort of what is the alternative. I'm very grateful that I have Daf Yomi in my life, because it is very clear to me that I would not be learning Talmud right now if not for it.
Yeah.
I have an alternative for you. It's a yeshiva called Svara.
Well,
and I want you to come, but okay, wait, Dan, do we have 1 more minute?
Sure.
Okay.
I mean, it's okay with me if Ilana has another minute.
Sure.
Okay. I want to pick up on something that you say in the book, and you also talked about it in your Eli talk, which is really beautiful. You say, with each passing day, if I learn Daf Yomi, I wouldn't be just 1 day older, I'd be 1 day wiser. And I want to push back on the question, or I just want to ask, do you feel like it's made you wiser? And does learning Daf Yomi actually convey wisdom, or does it convey a certain amount of material which makes you feel connected, and it gives you sort of a daily practice and blah, blah, blah? And by the way, in this question, I want to acknowledge that my deepest, darkest fear about my own work is that I'm not 1,000% sure that I'm right, that the way we learn Talmud is in fact formative in shaping of the kind of human being that I contend it is. I hope it is. I hope it shapes people into this certain kind of human being that I think the tradition wants us to be, more profoundly empathic, more connected to others, more able to tolerate contradiction and paradox and so on, to hold our truths lightly and be more crash flex. And so that's my own question for myself. And although we may not have time to answer, that's also my ultimate question for you. In what sense has it, if it has, made you wiser? How does that kind of learning make one wiser?
I do think it has made me wiser. I think it's made me wiser in the sense that I said before, Talmud is sort of like the soundtrack for my life, but maybe a better image is, sort of like the music that's always playing in the background, and often quite literally, because I'm always listening to podcasts anytime I'm walking. And when my phone rings, I seriously have to think to myself, like, should I answer this call? Like, is this Beatul Torah? I shouldn't say that. No one will ever call me again. But anyway, let alone Kvod Abriot. But anyway, but I think in a way it's sort of like the beat against which my life is syncopated. That is to say, everything that happens in life, sort of that happens to me over the course of the day, exists in potential relation to the daf that I'm learning. It's like that beat that's underlying everything. It's sort of setting the rhythm. And because I have that underlying rhythm, and the other things that happen to me that might just be like unrelated notes become sort of harmonies. Now, I'm not musical, so maybe this is a really bad metaphor. I don't know.
No, I hear you. I get it. I really hear
it's
that.
creating a music. It's creating a music, and that music is deepening and enriching. And more than it's made me wiser, I want to say it's definitely made me happier. And I think that some of that is really me and really my temperament. But I'm a person who has to get something done, has to feel like I'm getting things done, and often will make to-do lists just for the sake of being able to cross things off. I'm a real to-do list person. And the nature of my life right now as a parent of an infant and several young children who need a lot of attention all the time. We took the kids to the park today, and my husband said, like, okay, we might even have time to talk if they all play. And like every single kid needed both of us at every single moment. And it was like a joke. Like, we took them to the park thinking whatever, like kids need a lot all the time. And it's very hard to feel like you ever able to use your head, when you're in the trenches with kids. And making this commitment to learn the daf every day means that at the end of every day, I can say, well, I know that I am fundamentally, first and foremost, a person who loves words and loves text. And if I can make a space for that every day, a fixed space, and it's not just like reading, like whatever novel I'm reading, because I do that too, but this is about a sacred devotional practice, because I don't think, for me, the Talmud is different from reading anything else, mainly because of what you said, because of what the Talmud is, that I forget how you put it, but it was very beautiful, about how it's the DNA of our tradition. It sort of teaches us how our tradition has evolved and can evolve. I agree with all of that. And being in a daily conversation with that text, enables me to feel like I'm a part of something much larger than myself, that I'm a part of a transgenerational conversation, that I have a community I have interlocutors who are older than age 9. And for me, that's very, very valuable, both intellectually and spiritually. Yeah.
Well, Ilana, I just really want to thank you for taking an hour plus of the 2 to 3 spare hours that you have in the evening to spend with us. And this is great. I have to say that my experience of this conversation is of a piece with what I was trying to describe with my experience of doing Daf Yomi, which is like, wow, this conversation happened just the right week, and just after we did that Hillel and Shammai text from Eruvin 13b, and I wanted to talk a little bit more with B'nai about it next week, and so it's just perfect. And I'm so grateful to you. And B'nai, I think that I next one of, not necessarily next, but I'd like to find a text where the student kind of misbehaves and doesn't listen to the teacher, because I kind of feel like I'm doing that a little bit, and I'm proud of it. I kind of, I love that I'm doing this, I'm always like a bit of a contrarian, but I like that I'm also not listening to you 100%, because I usually do listen to you. So I just really want to thank both.
It won't be hard to find one of those stories, right, Ilana?
Well, I know there's the one where the rabbi snuck under the bed, but I don't know, that's not quite the same. But anyway, I just want to thank you, Ilana, for really just a fantastic, I'm so glad we had this conversation. I actually think that I hope that when people are watching this conversation, that they actually experience that text of Hillel and Shammai disagreeing and all being the words of God, because I think we all believe in that, and it's just amazing. I love the idea that we have 3 people who love studying Talmud and who kind of have slightly different takes on it, or substantially different takes on how to do it, and that we can sort of talk about it together. So I hope we'll talk again. I'm really so grateful for this conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Ilana, thank you so much. This was so wonderful.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.